The emergency room at Riverside Medical Center had seen chaos before, but nothing like this. Hurricane Elena was bearing down on Port Haven, Florida, with winds exceeding 160 miles per hour, and the hospital was operating on skeleton crew while serving as the city's primary evacuation shelter. Most staff had evacuated with their families, leaving behind only the most dedicated healthcare workers to face the storm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Among them was Claire Thompson, a 26-year-old nurse who had graduated from nursing school just 8 months earlier. While her colleagues with seniority had been granted leave to secure their homes and families, Claire volunteered to stay. She lived alone in a small apartment at Pinewood Apartments, had no family in the area, and felt a deep responsibility to help those who couldn't help themselves. What Claire didn't know was that this decision would change her life forever. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as another gust of wind rattled the reinforced windows of Riverside Medical Center. Claire Thompson pulled her dark hair back into a ponytail and checked her watch, 11:47 p.m. Hurricane Elena was still hours away from making landfall, but the emergency department was already overwhelmed with injured evacuees, panicked families, and medical emergencies that couldn't wait for calmer weather. Claire moved through the crowded corridors with practiced efficiency, her scrubs already wrinkled from a 14-hour shift that was nowhere near finished. The hospital had transformed into something resembling a refugee camp, with families huddled in waiting areas, children crying, and the constant hum of generators providing backup power as the main electrical grid flickered unpredictably. Dr. Richard Kane, the hospital administrator, strode through the emergency department with his clipboard clutched tightly in his manicured hands. His expensive suit looked out of place among the chaos, and his constantly furrowed brow suggested he was more concerned with liability and protocol than patient care. He spotted Claire administering 4 fluids to an elderly man who had been brought in with dehydration. "Thompson," Dr. Kane called out sharply, approaching her station. "I need you to focus on the critical cases only. We can't waste resources on every minor ailment that walks through those doors tonight." Claire looked up from her patient, a man in his 70s who had been living in his car since the evacuation orders came through. "Mr. Peterson here hasn't had fluids or medication for his diabetes in over 18 hours, Dr. Kane. This isn't minor." Dr. Kane glanced at the man's worn clothing and weathered appearance, then back at Claire with visible irritation. "Use your judgment, but remember we have limited supplies and unlimited demand tonight. Prioritize accordingly." Patricia Wells, the head nurse on duty, appeared beside Dr. Kane like a shadow. Patricia had been working at Riverside Medical for nearly 2 decades and had developed a reputation for being efficient, cold, and utterly focused on following hospital hierarchy. She wore her authority like armor, and her interactions with newer staff members often felt more like military commands than collegial guidance. "Thompson," Patricia said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "Dr. Kane is right. We need to move faster tonight. Some of these people should be directed to the general shelter areas rather than taking up medical resources." Claire felt her cheeks flush with frustration, but she kept her voice steady. "With respect, Ms. Wells, I became a nurse to help people, especially when they need it most. Mr. Peterson needs medical attention, regardless of what he looks like or where he's staying." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "What people look like has nothing to do with medical triage, Thompson. But what matters is efficiency and following protocol. Don't let your emotions cloud your professional judgment." The exchange was interrupted by a commotion near the emergency entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical wheeze, and a gust of wind and rain swept into the building. Through the doors stumbled a family of 4, soaked to the bone and clearly in distress. The father appeared first, carrying a young girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She was unconscious, her face pale, and her breathing shallow. Behind him came a woman, presumably the mother, supporting a boy who looked to be around 12. The boy was conscious but favoring his left leg, blood seeping through a makeshift bandage around his calf. The father wore simple khaki pants and a white button-down shirt, both now torn and stained with mud and blood. His hair was disheveled, his face streaked with dirt, and his eyes held the wild desperation of a parent whose child is in danger. The mother's floral dress was practically shredded, and her hands were cut and bleeding from what appeared to be broken glass. They looked like any other family caught in the storm's path, displaced, frightened, and in need of immediate medical attention. "Help," the father called out, his voice cracking with exhaustion and panic. "Please, my daughter, she hit her head when our car flipped. She's been unconscious for over an hour." Claire immediately abandoned her paperwork and rushed toward the family. Her training kicked in as she quickly assessed the situation, potential Head trauma in the child, possible fracture or laceration in the boy, and multiple cuts and shock symptoms in both parents. Let's get her onto a gurney right now, Claire said, her voice calm but urgent. She called over her shoulder to a nearby orderly, I need a trauma bed immediately. Dr. Kane looked up from his clipboard, observing the scene with clinical detachment. He took in the family's appearance, their muddy clothes, their obvious lack of preparation for the storm, and their desperate demeanor, and his expression shifted to one of barely concealed annoyance. Thompson, he called out, process them through standard intake first. We need documentation before treatment. Claire turned to face him, incredulous. Dr. Kane, this child has a potential traumatic brain injury. Documentation can wait. Protocol exists for a reason, Patricia Wells interjected, stepping forward with her clipboard. Everyone gets processed through intake, regardless of the circumstances. The father, who had been listening to this exchange while holding his unconscious daughter, looked between the medical staff with growing desperation. Please, he said, his voice breaking, I don't care about paperwork. My daughter needs help. Now. Claire looked into his eyes and saw something that went beyond panic. She saw a father's love and helplessness that transcended any consideration of protocol or policy. Without hesitation, she made her decision. Follow me, she said. To the family, leading them directly toward the trauma bay. We'll handle the paperwork later. Thompson. Patricia Wells called after her. You're violating direct orders. Claire didn't turn around. Instead, she continued guiding the family toward the treatment area, calling out instructions to the medical team. I need a neurological assessment kit, stat. And get me a pediatric for setup. The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos as Claire and the emergency team began working on the unconscious girl. Claire's hands moved with practiced precision as she checked the child's pupils, tested her reflexes, and monitored her vital signs. The father stood nearby, his face etched with worry, while the mother sat on a nearby chair having her cuts cleaned and bandaged. What's her name? Claire asked gently as she worked. Sophie, the father replied. Sophie Harrison. She's 8 years old. And your son? Alex. He's 12. Claire nodded, making mental notes while continuing her assessment. Sophie's vital signs are stable, but we need to run some tests to rule out any serious brain injury. The good news is that her pupils are responsive and her reflexes seem normal. As she spoke, Claire noticed that despite the family's disheveled appearance, there were subtle details that didn't quite fit the narrative of a typical displaced family. The father's watch, though covered in mud, appeared to be an expensive Swiss timepiece. The mother's torn dress, despite its current condition, had the cut and quality of high-end designer clothing. Even the children's shoes, though dirty and worn from their ordeal, looked like premium brands. But Claire's focus remained entirely on providing medical care. Her background had taught her that emergencies were great equalizers, rich or poor, everyone bled the same color, everyone felt pain the same way, and everyone deserved the same level of compassionate care. Dr. Kane appeared at the entrance to the trauma bay, his expression thunderous. Thompson, I need to speak with you. Now. Claire continued monitoring Sophie's foredrip without looking up. I'm in the middle of patient care, Dr. Kane. Can it wait? No, it cannot wait. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. You've violated direct orders and disrupted our intake protocol. This is exactly the kind of emotional decision-making that leads to chaos in emergency situations. The father, David Harrison, looked between Claire and Dr. Kane with growing concern. Is there a problem with my daughter receiving treatment? Dr. Kane addressed him with the practiced tone of administrative efficiency. Sir, there's no problem with treatment, but we do have procedures that must be followed. I'm going to need you to complete our standard intake forms, provide insurance information, and I'll pay whatever it costs, David interrupted. Money isn't an issue. I just want my daughter taken care of. Patricia Wells appeared beside Dr. Kane, holding a thick stack of forms. Everyone says money isn't an issue until they see the bill, she said with a sardonic smile. Trust me, sir, you'll want to work with your insurance company on this. Claire felt her anger rising as she watched the interaction. Here was a family in crisis, a child with a potential brain injury, and the administrative staff was focused on paperwork and payment procedures. She had entered nursing because she believed in providing care first and worrying about bureaucracy later. The intake forms can be completed while we're treating Sophie, Claire said firmly. There's no medical reason to delay her care. Dr. Kane's face reddened. Thompson, you're a new graduate with less than a year of experience. You don't make policy decisions in my emergency department. The confrontation was interrupted by a soft moan from the gurney. Sophie's eyes fluttered open, and she looked around the trauma bay with confusion and fear. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small and frightened. David Harrison's face lit up with relief as he moved to his daughter's side. "I'm right here. Sweetheart. You're safe now." Claire immediately began a neurological assessment, checking Sophie's awareness and cognitive function. "Sophie, can you tell me your full name?" "Sophie Marie Harrison," the girl replied, her voice growing stronger. "And do you remember what happened?" Sophie's brow furrowed as she concentrated. "We were driving to the shelter, and then there was a big tree, and Daddy tried to turn, but the car went sideways and then upside down." Claire nodded, making notes. These were all positive signs. Sophie's memory was intact, her speech was clear, and her cognitive function appeared normal. The unconsciousness had likely been due to shock and exhaustion rather than serious brain trauma. "You're going to be fine, Sophie," Claire said with a warm smile. "You might have a headache for a few days, but you're a very brave girl." As Claire continued her examination, she couldn't help but notice the family's interactions. Despite their ordeal, there was something remarkably composed about them. David Harrison's concern for his children was evident, but he carried himself with a quiet confidence that suggested he was accustomed to handling crisis situations. Linda Harrison, the mother, despite her injuries and obvious exhaustion, maintained a grace and composure that spoke to inner strength. More importantly, Claire observed how they treated the hospital staff. Despite the dismissive attitude they had received from Dr. Kane and Patricia Wells, both parents were unfailingly polite and grateful. They thanked every nurse and orderly who helped them, they followed instructions without complaint, and they showed genuine concern for the other patients they saw in the emergency department. "Excuse me," Linda Harrison said to Claire as she was updating Sophie's chart, "the elderly gentleman you were helping when we arrived, is he going to be all right?" Claire looked over to where Mr. Peterson was still receiving 4 fluids. "He should be fine. He just needed some medical attention and a safe place to ride out the storm." "He looked like he was alone," Linda continued. "Does he have family with him?" "No, he's been living in his car since the evacuation orders," Claire replied, touched by Linda's concern for a stranger. David Harrison overheard the conversation and quietly approached Claire. "Would it be possible for us to cover his medical expenses? He shouldn't have to worry about bills on top of everything else he's dealing with." Claire was taken aback by the offer. Here was a family that had just been through their own traumatic experience, and their first thought was to help someone else in need. "That's very generous, Mr. Harrison, but, please," David said quietly. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "We've been fortunate in life, and if we can help someone who's struggling, we'd like to do that." Before Claire could respond, Dr. Kane appeared again, this time with a security guard in tow. "Thompson, I've asked you multiple times to follow proper intake procedures. If you can't follow direct orders, I'll have to ask you to step away from patient care." The security guard, Tony Rodriguez, looked uncomfortable with the situation. Tony had worked at Riverside Medical for 5 years and had always respected Claire's dedication and compassion. He had seen her stay late countless times to comfort patients, spend her own money buying food for families who couldn't afford the cafeteria, and consistently go above and beyond her job requirements. "Dr. Kane," Tony said hesitantly, "maybe we could." "No maybes," Dr. Kane cut him off. "Rules are rules, especially during emergency situations." Claire felt the weight of the moment. She could comply with Dr. Kane's demands, complete the bureaucratic requirements, and potentially delay care for other patients who needed her help. Or she could stand by her principles and risk her job by continuing to prioritize patient care over administrative convenience. The decision was made easier when she looked at Sophie Harrison, now sitting up on the gurney and coloring in a book that one of the other nurses had brought her. The little girl looked up at Claire with bright, grateful eyes. "Thank you for helping us," Sophie said simply. "You made me feel safe." In that moment, Claire knew that whatever consequences came from her actions, she had made the right choice. Medicine was about healing people, not processing paperwork. It was about showing compassion in moments of crisis, not following protocol at the expense of human dignity. "You're very welcome, Sophie," Claire replied. "That's what nurses are here for." Dr. Kane's expression grew even more severe. "Thompson, this is your final warning. Either follow hospital protocol or find yourself another place to work." David Harrison, who had been listening to the entire exchange, stepped forward. His demeanor remained calm, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was not a man accustomed to being dismissed or watching others be mistreated. "Dr. Kane," he said quietly, "I'd like to speak with you privately about your staff members' conduct." Dr. Kane looked David up and down, taking in his torn clothing and disheveled appearance. Sir, I appreciate your concern, but personnel matters are not open for discussion with patients. I understand, David replied. But perhaps you might reconsider your assessment of the situation. Patricia Wells stepped forward, her authority on full display. Mr. Harrison, we appreciate your feedback, but Nurse Thompson has violated multiple hospital policies tonight. Her behavior, while well-intentioned, has been unprofessional and disruptive. Claire felt her heart sink. She had known this moment might come, but she hadn't expected it to happen so publicly or in front of a family she had been trying to help. She began to wonder if her idealism was simply incompatible with the realities of hospital administration. But as she looked around the emergency department, at Mr. Peterson receiving the care he needed, at Sophie Harrison coloring peacefully while recovering from her head injury, at the dozens of other patients who had received compassionate treatment. Despite the chaos, she realized that her actions had made a real difference. Sometimes, Claire thought to herself, making a difference was worth the risk. The storm outside continued to rage, Hurricane Elena drawing closer to landfall with each passing hour. But inside Riverside Medical Center, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would soon reveal that assumptions based on appearances could be just as destructive as any natural disaster. What none of them knew was that David Harrison had been making mental notes of his own throughout the evening. He had observed Dr. Kane's dismissive attitude toward patients who appeared to lack resources. He had watched Patricia Wells prioritize paperwork over patient care. And he had witnessed Claire Thompson risk her job to ensure that his family, and others, received the compassionate treatment they needed. David Harrison had built his reputation and his fortune by being an excellent judge of character, and he had seen enough tonight to know exactly who deserved his respect and who didn't. As the hours passed and Hurricane Elena continued its relentless approach toward Port Haven, none of them could have imagined that this night would become a turning point that would change their lives forever. The storm was just getting started, and so was the story. The clock on the emergency department wall read 3:17 a.m. when Hurricane Elena finally made landfall. The building shuddered as winds exceeding 170 miles per hour slammed into Port Haven, and the backup generators kicked in as the main power grid failed completely. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows throughout the hospital corridors, and the constant howling of wind created an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos. Claire had been working for over 18 hours straight, but adrenaline and determination kept her moving through the packed emergency department. The Harrison family had been moved to a quieter observation area where Sophie could rest while being monitored for any delayed symptoms from her head injury. Alex's leg had been properly cleaned and bandaged, requiring 12 stitches but no serious intervention. What struck Claire most about the family was their resilience and concern for others. Despite their own ordeal, David and Linda Harrison had spent much of the night helping other families, sharing snacks they had salvaged from their destroyed vehicle, and comforting frightened children who had been separated from their parents. During the evacuation, Dr. Kane had retreated to his office, emerging periodically to issue orders and express his frustration with the mounting chaos. Patricia Wells continued her authoritarian rounds, clipboard in hand, treating the emergency situation like a military operation that required strict adherence to protocol above all else. Around 4 a.m, a new crisis emerged. An elderly woman named Mrs. Carmen Rodriguez was brought in by ambulance, unconscious and barely breathing. She had been found in her collapsed mobile home by rescue workers, and preliminary assessment suggested severe internal injuries and possible cardiac complications. Claire immediately joined the trauma team working on Mrs. Rodriguez, but it quickly became apparent that the woman's condition was beyond what Riverside Medical Center could handle. She needed immediate surgery and specialized cardiac care that was only available at Tampa General Hospital, nearly 200 miles away. The problem was transportation. Hurricane Elena had grounded all air ambulances, closed major highways, and made ground transport extremely dangerous. The woman was stable for the moment, but her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Dr. Kane stood over Mrs. Rodriguez's gurney, shaking his head grimly. "There's nothing we can do. All emergency transport is suspended until the hurricane passes. We'll have to make her as comfortable as possible and hope for the best." Claire felt her stomach tighten with frustration. "Dr. Kane, surely there has to be something we can do. Some way to get her to Tampa General." "Thompson, I've already explained this to you multiple times tonight," Patricia Wells interrupted sharply. "We cannot control weather conditions or transportation logistics. Our job is to work within the constraints we're given, not chase impossible solutions." David Harrison, who had been sitting nearby with his family, overheard the conversation. He stood up slowly and approached the medical team with a thoughtful expression. "Excuse me," he said quietly to Dr. Kane. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion about the patient needing transport to Tampa General. Dr. Kane looked at David with barely concealed irritation. Sir, this is a medical emergency discussion. I need to ask you to return to the waiting area. I understand, David replied calmly. But I may be able to help with the transportation issue. Patricia Wells let out a small, condescending laugh. Mr. Harrison, I appreciate your desire to help, but emergency medical transport requires specialized equipment and trained personnel. This isn't something civilians can assist with. David's expression remained patient, but Claire noticed a subtle change in his posture. Actually, I have access to a medical helicopter that's specifically designed for emergency transport. It's currently stationed at a private facility about 20 miles inland, in a hangar that's designed to withstand hurricane-force winds. Dr. Kane's eyebrows rose skeptically. Sir, I'm sure you mean well, but medical helicopters cost millions of dollars and require extensive licensing and insurance. You can't just call in favors during a natural disaster. The helicopter belongs to me, David said simply. Along with a fully trained medical flight crew that's on standby for exactly these types of emergencies. The emergency department fell silent except for the continuous roar of wind outside. Claire stared at David Harrison, trying to process what she had just heard. Patricia Wells' mouth opened and closed without producing any sound. Dr. Kane's clipboard slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. You own a medical helicopter? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded. Among other things. The crew can be here within 30 minutes, and they can have Mrs. Rodriguez at Tampa General in less than an hour, assuming the hurricane eye passes over us as predicted. Dr. Kane struggled to regain his composure. Mr. Harrison, if what you're saying is true, then yes, that could save this woman's life. But I need to understand who you are and how you have access to these resources. Linda Harrison stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her husband's arm. David, maybe it's time to explain. David looked around the emergency department, taking in the dozens of families huddled throughout the corridors, the exhausted medical staff working beyond their limits, and the general atmosphere of controlled desperation that had defined the night. My name is David Harrison, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the emergency department. I'm the founder and CEO of Harrison Global Industries. The name hit like a thunderbolt. Harrison Global Industries was one of the largest technology and renewable energy companies in the world, with operations spanning 6 continents and annual revenues exceeding $50 billion. David Harrison was routinely listed among the wealthiest individuals on the planet, and his company's innovations in clean energy had revolutionized multiple industries. Claire felt her knees go weak. The man whose daughter she had treated, whose family she had defended against Dr. Kane's bureaucratic indifference, was one of the most powerful businessmen in the world. The family she had seen as fellow storm victims were members of one of America's most prominent business dynasties. Dr. Kane's face went through a series of color changes, from pale white to deep red and back again. Patricia Wells actually stumbled backward, catching herself against a nearby wall. Several other staff members who had been listening to the conversation stood frozen in shock. Mr. Harrison, Dr. Kane stammered, I had no idea. If I had known who you were, we would have immediately provided you with our VIP treatment protocols. David's expression hardened slightly. Dr. Kane, that's exactly the problem. The quality of medical care shouldn't depend on who someone is or how much money they have. Every person who walked through those doors tonight deserved the same level of compassion and attention. He gestured toward Claire, who was still processing the revelation. Nurse Thompson didn't know who I was, and she didn't care. She saw a family in crisis and provided excellent medical care because that's what medical professionals should do. She put my daughter's needs ahead of your administrative procedures, and she did it because she believes in helping people. Patricia Wells attempted to salvage the situation. Mr. Harrison, I'm sure you understand that we have protocols in place for good reasons. Nurse Thompson, while well-intentioned, did violate several important hospital policies tonight. David turned to face Patricia directly, and Claire noticed that his entire demeanor had shifted. Gone was the desperate father seeking help for his injured children. In his place stood a man accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of employees and billions of dollars in revenue. Ms. Wells, he said, his voice carrying quiet authority, I've been observing your hospital's operations for the past several hours. I've seen how you prioritize paperwork over patient care, how you treat people differently based on their appearance, and how you punish staff members for showing compassion. He paused, letting his words sink in. I've also seen how Nurse Thompson has gone above and beyond to help not just my family, but every patient she's encountered tonight. She's exactly the kind of medical professional that hospitals should be. Developing and promoting, not disciplining. The emergency department had grown completely quiet. Other families had stopped their conversations to listen, nurses had paused in their duties, and even the administrative staff had emerged from their offices to witness the confrontation. Claire found her voice. "Mr. Harrison, you don't need to defend me. I knew what I was doing when I chose to prioritize patient care over protocols." David smiled at her, and for a moment his expression returned to that of the grateful father she had first met. "Claire, you've shown my family kindness and professionalism during one of the most frightening experiences of our lives. You treated us with dignity when others saw only an inconvenience. That kind of character deserves recognition, not punishment." He turned back to Dr. Kane. "Now, about Mrs. Rodriguez. Are you going to authorize the helicopter transport, or do I need to speak with your hospital's board of directors?" Dr. Kane nodded frantically. "Yes, absolutely. Mr. Harrison, please make whatever arrangements are necessary. We'll prepare Mrs. Rodriguez for immediate transport." David pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Within minutes, he had coordinated with his helicopter crew, contacted Tampa General Hospital to prepare for the incoming patient, and arranged for the flight path that would take advantage of the hurricane's eye-wall passage. As the medical team prepared Mrs. Rodriguez for transport, Claire couldn't help but reflect on the dramatic reversal that had just taken place. 30 minutes earlier, Dr. Kane had been threatening her job security. Now he was deferring to the man whose family she had chosen to help against his direct orders. The helicopter arrived exactly when David had promised, its experienced crew working seamlessly with the hospital staff to transfer Mrs. Rodriguez safely. The aircraft disappeared into the storm, carrying a woman whose life had been saved by the intervention of a billionaire who had been dismissed as just another storm victim hours earlier. As the emergency department returned to its previous level of controlled chaos, Dr. Kane approached David Harrison with an expression of nervous anticipation. "Mr. Harrison," he began hesitantly, "I want to apologize for any misunderstandings tonight. Obviously, if we had known who you were from the beginning, we would have handled things very differently." David's response was measured and deliberate. "Dr. Kane, the fact that you would have treated my family differently based on my identity is exactly what's wrong with your approach to healthcare. Every family that came through those doors tonight was dealing with a crisis, regardless of their economic status." He gestured around the emergency department. "That elderly man over there who Nurse Thompson insisted on treating for dehydration? He deserved the same quality of care as my daughter. The single mother with 3 children who's been waiting for 2 hours to have her son's broken arm examined? She deserves the same respect as my wife." Patricia Wells attempted to interject. "Mr. Harrison, surely you understand that resource allocation requires difficult decisions during emergency situations." "Resource allocation," David repeated, his voice taking on a colder tone. "Is that what you call dismissing patients based on their appearance? Is that what you call threatening to fire a nurse for providing compassionate care?" Claire watched the interaction with a mixture of fascination and concern. She had never seen hospital administrators so thoroughly challenged on their policies and attitudes. But she also worried about the long-term consequences for herself and her colleagues once the Harrison family left and normal operations resumed. David seemed to sense her concern. "Claire, I'd like to speak with you privately for a moment, if that's all right." They walked to a quiet corner of the emergency department, away from the listening ears of the administrative staff. Sophie and Alex Harrison were both sleeping peacefully in the observation area, finally able to rest after their traumatic night. "Claire," David began, "I want you to know that what I witnessed tonight has had a profound impact on me. You showed my family genuine care and compassion when we needed it most, and you did it without any knowledge of who we were or what we might be able to offer in return." Claire felt overwhelmed by the events of the night. "Mr. Harrison, I just did what any nurse should do. Your family needed help, and I was in a position to provide it." "That's exactly my point," David replied. "You acted according to your principles, even when it put your job at risk. That kind of integrity is rare, and it deserves to be recognized." He paused, looking around the emergency department at the continuing efforts of the medical staff. "I've been thinking about something during these past few hours. Harrison Global Industries has been considering expanding into healthcare technology and medical services. We're looking for partners who share our commitment to innovation and human dignity." Claire wasn't sure where the conversation was heading, but she sensed that David Harrison was building towards something significant. "What I'm about to tell you needs to stay between us for now," David continued. "But I've decided that Riverside Medical Center needs new leadership that prioritizes patient care over bureaucratic convenience." He looked directly at Claire. "I'm going to be making some calls tomorrow morning. By the end of the week, this hospital is going to have new administration, new policies, and a renewed commitment to treating every patient with dignity and respect." Claire's eyes widened. "Mr. Harrison, you can't just change an entire hospital because of one night." "Actually, I can," David said with a slight smile. "Harrison Global Industries is going to be making a substantial investment in this hospital's future. And when we do, we're going to need medical professionals who understand that healthcare is about healing people, not processing paperwork." The implications of his words began to sink in. "Mr. Harrison, are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you an opportunity," he replied. "An opportunity to help build a medical facility that operates according to the principles you demonstrated tonight. A place where compassionate care isn't seen as a violation of protocol, but as the fundamental purpose of medicine." Before Claire could respond, a commotion near the emergency entrance drew their attention. The doors had opened, and a family of refugees was stumbling inside, having clearly walked for miles through the hurricane. They were completely soaked, carrying 2 small children, and the father appeared to be injured. Without hesitation, Claire moved toward them, ready to provide whatever assistance they needed. David Harrison watched her go, seeing once again the automatic compassion and professionalism that had impressed him throughout the night. As Claire began triaging the new arrivals, Patricia Wells appeared beside her with a clipboard and a stern expression. "Thompson," Patricia said sharply, "I want these people processed through proper intake before any treatment begins. We've had enough protocol violations for one night." Claire looked at the injured father, who was bleeding from a head wound and could barely stand upright. She looked at the 2 small children, who were shivering with cold and fear. She looked at Patricia Wells, who was more concerned with paperwork than human suffering. And then she made her choice. "The paperwork can wait," Claire said firmly, guiding the family toward a treatment area. "These people need medical attention now." Patricia Wells' face turned red with anger. "Thompson, if you take one more step without completing intake procedures, you'll be looking for a new job tomorrow morning." Claire paused for just a moment, considering the threat and its implications. Then she looked back at Patricia with calm determination. "Some things are more important than job security," she said, and continued walking with the family toward the treatment area. David Harrison, watching the entire exchange, smiled with satisfaction. He had seen everything he needed to see, and he had made his decision about Claire Thompson's future. Now he just needed to make some phone calls to ensure that her principals would never again be seen as a liability. The storm outside was beginning to weaken as Hurricane Elena moved inland, but the real changes were just beginning. By morning, Riverside Medical Center would never be the same, and Claire Thompson would discover that sometimes doing the right thing leads to opportunities beyond anything you could have imagined. Patricia Wells stood frozen in the corridor, watching Claire disappear with the refugee family, unable to comprehend that her authority had been so completely disregarded. Dr. Kane remained nearby, still trying to process the revelation that he had been treating one of the world's most influential businessmen like an ordinary storm victim. Neither of them realized that their careers at Riverside Medical Center had effectively ended the moment they chose bureaucracy over compassion. David Harrison had been making mental notes all night, and he had seen enough to know exactly what changes needed to be made. The hurricane was almost over, but the transformation it had set in motion was just beginning. Dawn broke over Port Haven with an eerie calm that followed Hurricane Elena's passage. The storm had moved inland, leaving behind a landscape of twisted metal, uprooted trees, and flooded streets. Riverside Medical Center had survived the night, its reinforced structure standing firm against nature's fury, but the real transformation happening inside the building had nothing to do with wind or rain. Claire Thompson stood at the large windows of the break room, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She had finally taken a brief respite after 22 hours of continuous work, her body exhausted but her mind racing with everything that had happened. The refugee family she had treated against Patricia Wells' direct orders was now stable and resting comfortably, their father's head wound properly sutured and their children warming up under heated blankets. The emergency department had finally begun to empty as the immediate crisis passed. Families who had sought shelter were beginning to venture outside to assess the damage to their homes, and the non-critical patients were being discharged with instructions for follow-up care. The atmosphere had shifted from desperate chaos to cautious relief. Claire sipped her coffee and reflected on the night's events. Every decision she had made had felt right in the moment, but now she wondered about the consequences. Patricia Wells had made her threats clear, and Dr. Kane had witnessed multiple instances of what they considered insubordination. Even with David Harrison's support, Claire knew that hospital politics could be complicated and vindictive. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Rivera, a fellow nurse who had become one of her closest friends at Riverside Medical. Marcus was in his early 30s, a Navy veteran who had transitioned to healthcare after his military service. He had worked at the hospital for 3 years and had always been one of Claire's strongest supporters. Claire, Marcus said, settling into the chair across from her, you need to know what's happening out there. Claire looked at him with concern. What do you mean? Marcus glanced around the break room to ensure they were alone, then leaned forward conspiratorially. Patricia Wells has been in Dr. Kane's office for the past hour. I could hear them through the door, and they're planning to fire you as soon as the day shift supervisor arrives. Claire felt her stomach drop, though the news wasn't entirely unexpected. What exactly are they saying? They're documenting every protocol violation from last night, Marcus explained. Treating patients without proper intake, refusing direct orders from supervisors, disrupting emergency procedures. They're building a case that you're a liability to the hospital. Claire set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. Despite everything that had happened, despite David Harrison's promises of support, the immediate reality was that she was about to lose her job. The job she had worked so hard to get, the career she had dreamed about since childhood. There's something else, Marcus continued. Patricia has been calling other hospitals in the area, giving what she calls professional references about your performance here. She's essentially trying to blacklist you from working anywhere else in the region. The cruelty of the action hit Claire like a physical blow. It was one thing to fire her for violating hospital policies, but attempting to destroy her entire career was vindictive beyond anything she had imagined. Marcus, what am I going to do? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nursing is all I know. It's all I've ever wanted to do. Marcus reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Claire, you did the right thing last night. Every single decision you made was about helping people who needed help. Don't let them make you doubt that. Before Claire could respond, the break room door opened and Tony Rodriguez, the security guard, stepped inside. His expression was serious, but not unkind. Claire, he said gently, Dr. Kane wants to see you in his office immediately. Claire's heart began racing. This was it. After less than a year as a registered nurse, her career was about to end because she had chosen compassion over bureaucracy. She followed Tony through the corridors of the hospital, passing by rooms where she had provided care throughout the night. In one room, she could see Mr. Peterson, the elderly diabetic, now stable and preparing for discharge. In another, the refugee family she had insisted on treating was sharing breakfast, their children laughing as they colored in donated coloring books. Every patient she passed represented a decision she had made to prioritize human need over administrative convenience. Even knowing the consequences, Claire realized she wouldn't change any of those decisions. Tony stopped outside Dr. Kane's office door and gave Claire an encouraging nod. Whatever happens in there, he said quietly, know that most of the staff respects what you did last night. Claire knocked on the door and heard Dr. Kane's voice calling her to enter. She stepped inside to find not only Dr. Kane and Patricia Wells, but also several people she didn't recognize. There was an older woman in an expensive business suit, a younger man with a briefcase, and standing near the window, David Harrison. Dr. Kane stood behind his desk, but his usual authoritative demeanor seemed strained. Patricia Wells sat rigidly in a chair, her clipboard clutched defensively in her hands. The unknown visitors occupied the remaining chairs, and David Harrison remained standing, his presence somehow commanding the entire room. Nurse Thompson, Dr. Kane began, his voice carefully controlled, thank you for joining us. I'd like you to meet Margaret Chen, the Chief Executive Officer of Harrison Healthcare Solutions. Claire looked at the woman in the business suit, confused by the introduction. Harrison Healthcare Solutions was a name she didn't recognize, though the Harrison connection was obvious. Margaret Chen stood and extended her hand to Claire. Miss Thompson, it's a pleasure to meet you. Mr. Harrison has told me quite a lot about your performance during last night's emergency. Claire shook the offered hand, still uncertain about what was happening. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with Harrison Healthcare Solutions. David Harrison stepped forward with a slight smile. That's because it didn't exist until about 2 hours ago. I established the company this morning as a subsidiary of Harrison Global Industries, specifically to address deficiencies in emergency medical care that I observed last night. Dr. Kane's face had gone pale. Patricia Wells was gripping her clipboard so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Margaret Chen opened a folder and consulted several documents. Ms. Thompson, we've been reviewing your personnel file, your academic records from nursing school, and reports from colleagues about your performance. We've also conducted extensive interviews with patients you treated last night. Claire felt increasingly confused. I'm not sure I understand what's happening here. David Harrison answered her directly. Claire, what's happening is that Harrison Healthcare Solutions has just acquired Riverside Medical Center. As of this morning, this hospital is under new management, with new policies, and a renewed commitment to patient-centered care. The Words hit the room like a thunderbolt. Dr. Kane actually stumbled backward, catching himself against his desk. Patricia Wells made a small choking sound. "Mr. Harrison," Dr. Kane stammered, "surely there are legal procedures, board approvals, regulatory requirements." The younger man with the briefcase stood up. "Dr. Kane, I'm James Mitchell from Harrison Legal. All necessary paperwork has been filed with the appropriate regulatory agencies. The acquisition is complete and legally binding." Margaret Chin continued addressing Claire. "Ms. Thompson, we're offering you the position of Director of Emergency Services at the newly restructured Riverside Medical Center. You'll be responsible for implementing patient care protocols that prioritize compassion and medical excellence over bureaucratic convenience." Claire felt the room spinning around her. Less than an hour ago, she had been facing termination and career destruction. Now she was being offered a leadership position at the same hospital. "I don't understand," she said weakly. "I'm a new graduate with less than a year of experience." David Harrison spoke again. "Claire, experience is valuable, but character is irreplaceable. Last night, you demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership that healthcare needs. You made difficult decisions under pressure, you advocated for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves, and you maintained your principles even when it threatened your job security." Patricia Wells finally found her voice. "This is absurd. Nurse Thompson violated multiple hospital policies. She refused direct orders from supervisors. She's completely unqualified for any leadership position." Margaret Chin turned to face Patricia with a calm, professional expression. "Ms. Wells, your employment with Riverside Medical Center has been terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building within the next 15 minutes. Patricia's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Her clipboard fell from her hands and scattered papers across the floor. Dr. Kane looked desperately between the Harrison representatives. "What about me? I've been administrator here for 8 years. Surely my experience and institutional knowledge are valuable." James Mitchell consulted his legal documents. "Dr. Kane, your contract has been terminated for cause. Our investigation revealed multiple instances of discriminatory treatment of patients based on economic status, as well as documented retaliation against staff members who prioritized patient care." He handed Dr. Kane a sealed envelope. "Your severance package is detailed in this document. You have 2 hours to clear out your office." The transformation was happening so quickly that Claire could barely process it. The two people who had threatened her career were being escorted from the building, while she was being offered a position of authority she had never imagined possible. Margaret Chin addressed Claire again. "Miss Thompson, I understand this is overwhelming. You don't need to give us an answer immediately. But I want you to know that this offer comes with full authority to restructure emergency department policies, hire additional staff, and implement training programs that emphasize compassionate patient care." She handed Claire a folder containing detailed job descriptions and salary information. "You'll also have access to unlimited resources for continuing education, professional development, and any specialized training you feel would benefit patient care." Claire opened the folder and nearly gasped at the salary figure. It was more than triple what she had been earning as a staff nurse, with benefits that included full tuition reimbursement for advanced degrees and a comprehensive healthcare package. David Harrison stepped closer to Claire. "I want you to understand something important. This isn't charity, and it's not just gratitude for how you treated my family last night. This is a business decision based on your demonstrated ability to make good judgments under pressure." He gestured around the office. "Healthcare is changing, Claire. Patients are demanding more personalized, compassionate care, and hospitals that can't adapt to that demand will fail. What you showed last night is exactly the kind of leadership that will define successful healthcare in the future." Claire looked around the room at the faces watching her expectantly. She thought about her tiny apartment at Pinewood, her student loan debt, and her dreams of making a real difference in people's lives. She thought about Mr. Peterson, about Sophie Harrison, about the refugee family, and about all the patients she could help with the resources and authority being offered to her. "Mr. Harrison," she said slowly, "if I accept this position, I want to be clear about something. I will never compromise patient care for administrative convenience. I will never treat people differently based on their appearance or economic status. And I will never allow bureaucracy to prevent someone from receiving the medical attention they need." David Harrison smiled broadly. "Claire, those aren't obstacles to overcome. Those are exactly the principles we want you to implement." Margaret Chin stood and extended her hand again. "Ms. Thompson, do we have an agreement?" Claire took a deep breath, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 24 hours ago, she had been a junior nurse working double shifts to pay her bills. Now she was being offered the opportunity to transform how an entire hospital approached patient care. She shook Margaret Chen's hand firmly. "Yes, we have an agreement." The room erupted in congratulations and handshakes. James Mitchell began outlining the legal paperwork that needed to be completed, while Margaret Chen discussed timeline for implementing the new policies. David Harrison approached Claire as the activity swirled around them. "Claire, there's one more thing I want you to know. The helicopter transport that saved Mrs. Rodriguez last night? That's now a permanent resource for this hospital." Harrison. Healthcare Solutions is establishing a medical transport service that will ensure no patient dies waiting for specialized care. He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "What you did last night changed my perspective on healthcare in America. You showed me that there are still medical professionals who understand that healing is about more than profit margins and efficiency metrics." Claire felt tears forming in her eyes. "Mr. Harrison, I just did what felt right." "Exactly," he replied. "You did what felt right, even when it was difficult. That's the foundation of great leadership." As the meeting concluded and the various participants began to leave, Claire found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time since the night before. The magnitude of what had just happened was still sinking in. Her life had been completely transformed because she had chosen to treat a family with kindness and respect, not knowing they had the power to change everything. She walked back through the emergency department, which was now bustling with the day shift staff who were just learning about the dramatic changes in hospital management. Marcus Rivera intercepted her near the nurses' station. "Claire," he said, his eyes wide with amazement, "is it true? Are you really the new director of emergency services?" Claire nodded, still somewhat in disbelief herself. "Marcus, it's true. And one of my first decisions is going to be promoting you to assistant director. This hospital needs more people who understand that patient care comes first." Marcus's face lit up with joy and surprise. "Claire, I can't believe this is happening. Yesterday we were worried about losing our jobs for doing the right thing." "That's exactly the point," Claire replied. "We should never have to worry about doing the right thing. That's going to change, starting now." As the day progressed, word of the hospital's acquisition and Claire's promotion spread throughout Riverside Medical Center. The reaction from the medical staff was overwhelmingly positive. Nurses who had felt constrained by rigid protocols were excited about the possibility of patient-centered care. Doctors who had been frustrated by administrative interference were eager to participate in the restructuring. The transformation was already beginning, and Claire could see the potential for Riverside Medical Center to become the kind of hospital she had always dreamed of working in. A place where compassion wasn't seen as a liability, where patient needs drove decision-making, and where medical professionals could focus on healing rather than paperwork. The hurricane had passed, but the changes it had set in motion were just beginning to reshape everything in its path. 3 weeks after Hurricane Elena, Riverside Medical Center buzzed with an energy that felt entirely different from the sterile efficiency that had previously defined the hospital. Claire Thompson stood in her new office, reviewing architectural plans for the expanded emergency department that would double the facility's capacity while incorporating patient comfort areas and family consultation rooms. The transformation had been swift and comprehensive. Harrison Healthcare Solutions had invested $35 million in immediate renovations, equipment upgrades, and staff expansion. The hospital now boasted state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment, a fully equipped trauma center, and the most advanced emergency medical transport system in the southeastern United States. But the real change was cultural. The rigid hierarchy that had prioritized protocol over patient care had been replaced with collaborative teams focused on healing and compassion. Nurses were empowered to make clinical decisions without bureaucratic interference, and the entire staff had been retrained in patient-centered care principles. Claire's first major initiative had been the implementation of the Dignity First protocol, which ensured that every patient received the same high-quality care regardless of their insurance status, appearance, or economic background. No one would ever again be judged or dismissed based on their circumstances. Marcus Rivera knocked on her office door and entered with a broad smile. His promotion to assistant director had been popular with the nursing staff, and his military background had proven invaluable in organizing the rapid changes throughout the hospital. "Claire," he said, setting a folder on her desk, "you need to see these patient satisfaction scores. They're unlike anything this hospital has ever achieved." Claire opened the folder and studied the data. Patient satisfaction ratings had increased by over 40% in just 3 weeks. More importantly, the narrative comments revealed a fundamental shift in how people experienced care at Riverside Medical. One comment read, "The nurses treated my grandmother like she was their own family member. They took time to explain everything and made sure she was comfortable throughout her stay." Another stated, "I've never felt so respected and cared for in a medical setting. The staff here understands that patients are people, not just cases to be processed." Claire felt a deep sense of satisfaction reading the feedback. This was exactly what she had envisioned when she accepted the position. Healthcare that honored human dignity while maintaining medical excellence. "There's something else," Marcus continued. "Dr. Angela Foster from Johns Hopkins has accepted our offer to become Chief of Emergency Medicine. She's internationally recognized for trauma care innovation, and she specifically cited our patient care philosophy as the reason she wanted to join us." Claire looked up in amazement. Dr. Foster was legendary in emergency medicine circles, and her decision to leave Johns Hopkins for a regional hospital in Florida was unprecedented. It demonstrated that Harrison Healthcare Solutions' approach was attracting world-class talent who shared their vision. "When does she start?" Claire asked. "Next Monday. She's bringing 2 of her research fellows with her, and she wants to establish a fellowship program here for emergency medicine residents who are interested in compassionate care methodologies." The growth was happening faster than Claire had imagined possible. What had begun as a simple commitment to treating patients with dignity was evolving into a nationally recognized model for healthcare delivery. Her thoughts were interrupted by her administrative assistant, Jenny Walsh, who appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Miss Thompson," Jenny said, "you have a visitor. David Harrison is here, and he has someone with him he'd like you to meet." Claire's relationship with David Harrison had evolved from grateful patient family member to trusted advisor and friend. He visited the hospital regularly, not as an owner checking on his investment, but as someone genuinely interested in the positive changes taking place. Claire walked to the main lobby to find David Harrison standing with a woman she recognized from news reports and medical journals. Dr. Rebecca Martinez was the Surgeon General of the United States, the nation's top medical officer, and one of the most respected voices in American healthcare policy. "Claire," David said with his characteristic warm smile, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Martinez. She's been following the developments here at Riverside Medical with great interest." Dr. Martinez extended her hand to Claire with genuine enthusiasm. "Miss Thompson, it's an honor to meet you. The transformation you've led here has attracted attention at the highest levels of the Department of Health and Human Services." Claire felt slightly overwhelmed by the introduction. 3 weeks ago, she had been a junior nurse facing termination. Now she was meeting with the nation's top medical official about her work. "Dr. Martinez," Claire replied, "I'm honored that our efforts have gained such recognition, but honestly, we're just trying to provide the kind of care that every patient deserves." "That's exactly why I'm here," Dr. Martinez said. "The Dignity First protocol you've implemented represents a fundamental shift in how we can approach healthcare delivery. We'd like to study your model for potential implementation at federal medical facilities." David Harrison nodded approvingly. "Claire, Dr. Martinez isn't just here for a courtesy visit. The Department of Health and Human Services is considering Riverside Medical as a pilot site for a national initiative on patient-centered emergency care." The implications began to sink in. The changes Claire had implemented based on simple principles of compassion and respect were being evaluated as a model for healthcare transformation across the entire country. Dr. Martinez continued, "Ms. Thompson, we've reviewed your patient satisfaction data, your clinical outcomes, and your staff retention rates. In just 3 weeks, you've achieved improvements that most hospitals struggle to accomplish over years." She paused, consulting notes from a leather portfolio. "More importantly, you've demonstrated that prioritizing patient dignity doesn't compromise medical efficiency. In fact, your emergency department is now processing patients faster than before, with better outcomes and significantly higher satisfaction scores." Claire thought about the night of Hurricane Elena, when she had made decisions based on instinct and moral conviction rather than careful analysis of potential consequences. Those split-second choices to prioritize human need over bureaucratic process had somehow evolved into a healthcare model being studied by federal officials. "Dr. Martinez," Claire said, "I appreciate the recognition, but I want to be clear about something. The changes we've made here aren't revolutionary medical innovations. They're simply applications of basic human decency to healthcare delivery." Dr. Martinez smiled. "Ms. Thompson, that's exactly what makes your approach so powerful. You've proven that treating patients with dignity and respect isn't just morally right, it's clinically effective." David Harrison added, "Claire, there's another development you should know about. Harrison Healthcare Solutions has received inquiries from hospital systems in 12 states interested in implementing similar patient care protocols. We're being asked to consult on healthcare transformation projects across the country." The scope of the impact was breathtaking. What had begun with a commitment to help patients during a natural disaster was becoming a movement to change how healthcare operated at a national level. Dr. Martinez opened her portfolio and removed several official documents. Ms. Thompson, I'm here to formally invite you to serve on the National Advisory Committee for Patient-Centered Emergency Care. This is a federal committee that will develop recommendations for healthcare policy at the national level. Claire accepted the documents with trembling hands. The appointment would give her a voice in shaping healthcare policy for the entire United States, an opportunity to influence how millions of patients received care in emergency situations. There's also a personal invitation, Dr. Martinez continued. The President would like to meet with you next month to discuss your work here and its implications for national healthcare policy. Claire felt her knees go weak. The journey from junior nurse to presidential advisor seemed surreal, almost impossible to believe. David Harrison placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. Claire, I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to understand something important. These opportunities exist because you never compromised your principles, even when it would have been easier to do so. He gestured around the hospital lobby, which was filled with patients and families receiving care in an atmosphere of warmth and respect. Every decision you made during Hurricane Elena, every time you chose compassion over convenience, led to this moment. Dr. Martinez added, Ms. Thompson, your story has become inspiration for healthcare workers across the country. We've received hundreds of letters from nurses and doctors who have read about your experience and are working to implement similar patient care approaches in their own facilities. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but Claire felt ready to embrace it. She had discovered that principled leadership could create positive change beyond anything she had previously imagined. Dr. Martinez, Claire said, I accept the committee appointment, and I'm honored by the President's invitation. But I want to continue working here at Riverside Medical, implementing and refining these patient care approaches. That's exactly what we hoped you would say, Dr. Martinez replied. The committee work can be done remotely, and your continuing leadership here will provide ongoing data for the national initiative. As the meeting concluded and Dr. Martinez prepared to leave, she turned back to Claire with a final observation. Ms. Thompson, in my 30 years in medicine, I've seen countless attempts to reform healthcare through policy changes, technological innovations, and administrative restructuring. But what you've accomplished here proves that the most powerful transformation comes from simply remembering that patients are human beings who deserve dignity and compassion. After Dr. Martinez departed, Claire and David Harrison walked through the hospital together, observing the daily operations that had been transformed over the past 3 weeks. In the emergency department, they watched as nurses took time to explain procedures to patients, as doctors sat down beside families to discuss treatment options, and as staff members went out of their way to ensure patient comfort and understanding. David, Claire said as they observed the activity, sometimes I still can't believe this is real. 3 weeks ago, I was facing termination for the same principles that are now being studied by federal officials. David nodded thoughtfully. Claire, that's exactly why character matters more than credentials. Patricia Wells and Dr. Kane had impressive resumes and years of experience, but they had lost sight of why healthcare exists. He paused near the nurses' station where Marcus Rivera was consulting with a team of residents about patient care protocols. You never lost sight of that purpose, David continued. Even under pressure, even when threatened with consequences, you remained focused on helping people. That's the foundation of great leadership. Claire watched as a young resident carefully explained a procedure to an elderly patient, taking time to answer questions and provide reassurance. This was the culture they had built together, a place where medical excellence and human compassion reinforced each other. There's something I want to discuss with you, David said, leading Claire toward a quieter area of the hospital. Harrison Healthcare Solutions is planning a major expansion. We want to establish patient-centered medical facilities in 15 major cities over the next 5 years. Claire looked at him with interest. That sounds like an enormous undertaking. It is, David agreed. And we want you to lead the expansion. You would become Chief Executive Officer of Harrison Healthcare Solutions, with responsibility for establishing and managing medical facilities across the country. The offer was staggering in its scope. Claire would have the opportunity to implement patient-centered care principles on a national scale, potentially affecting millions of patients and thousands of healthcare workers. David, I'm honored by the offer, but I'm still learning how to manage one hospital. The idea of overseeing 15 facilities seems overwhelming. David smiled reassuringly. Claire, leadership isn't about having all the answers from the beginning. It's about maintaining your principles while growing into new challenges. You've already proven you can do that. He gestured around the bustling hospital. Look what you've accomplished here in just 3 weeks. You've transformed not just policies and procedures, but the entire culture of healthcare delivery. That's the kind of leadership that can change healthcare across the country. Claire considered the magnitude of the opportunity. She could continue the work that had begun during Hurricane Elena, expanding the principles of dignity and compassion to healthcare systems nationwide. I'll need time to think about it, she said finally. Of course, David replied. Take all the time you need. But remember, Claire, sometimes the biggest opportunities come disguised as overwhelming challenges. As they concluded their conversation, Claire reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. A natural disaster had created the circumstances that revealed her true character, and that character had opened doors to possibilities she had never imagined. The transformation that began with a simple commitment to patient care was evolving into a movement that could reshape American healthcare. And at the center of it all was a young nurse who had learned that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, could change not just individual lives but entire systems. The hurricane had passed, but the positive changes it had set in motion continued to grow stronger with each passing day. 6 months later, Claire Thompson stood at the podium of the Grand Ballroom in the Washington Convention Center, looking out at an audience of over 2,000 healthcare professionals, government officials, and medical students who had gathered for the National Healthcare Innovation Summit. The woman who had once worried about losing her job for showing compassion to patients was now delivering the keynote address on transforming American healthcare through dignity-centered practices. Behind her, a large screen displayed impressive statistics, patient satisfaction scores that had reached unprecedented levels, clinical outcomes that exceeded national averages, and staff retention rates that had become the envy of healthcare systems nationwide. But the numbers, while remarkable, told only part of the story. Ladies and gentlemen, Claire began, her voice carrying clearly throughout the ballroom, healthcare transformation doesn't begin with new technology or innovative procedures. It begins with remembering that every patient who walks through our doors is someone's mother, father, child, or friend. They deserve our respect, our attention, and our commitment to their well-being. The audience listened intently as Claire shared the journey that had brought her to this moment. She spoke about Hurricane Elena, about the choices she had made during that chaotic night, and about how those decisions had ultimately led to systemic changes that were now being implemented in medical facilities across the country. The lesson I learned that night, Claire continued, is that doing the right thing isn't always the easy thing, but it's always the necessary thing. When we prioritize human dignity over bureaucratic convenience, when we choose compassion over protocol, we don't just help individual patients, we elevate the entire profession of healthcare. In the audience, David Harrison sat with his family, including Sophie and Alex, who had fully recovered from their hurricane ordeal and had become passionate advocates for healthcare reform. Beside them sat Dr. Angela Foster, whose emergency medicine program at Riverside Medical had become a model for training the next generation of healthcare professionals. Also in attendance was Marcus Rivera, who had recently been promoted to Chief Operating Officer of Harrison Healthcare Solutions Southeastern Division. His military discipline combined with his commitment to patient-centered care had made him an invaluable leader in the organization's rapid expansion. Today, Claire announced from the podium, I'm proud to share that Harrison Healthcare Solutions will be opening 12 new medical facilities over the next 18 months, each designed around the principles of dignity, compassion, and clinical excellence. The audience erupted in applause. The expansion represented the largest private investment in patient-centered healthcare in American history, with each facility incorporating innovative design elements that prioritized patient comfort and family involvement in the healing process. Claire continued her presentation by highlighting specific improvements that had emerged from the dignity-first approach. Emergency departments operating under the new protocols were reducing patient wait times while simultaneously increasing satisfaction scores. Staff turnover had dropped dramatically as healthcare workers found renewed purpose in their work. Most importantly, clinical outcomes had improved across virtually every metric. We've learned that when patients feel respected and valued, they're more likely to follow treatment recommendations, more likely to seek preventive care, and more likely to trust the medical professionals caring for them, Claire explained. Compassion isn't just morally right, it's clinically effective. Following her presentation, Claire participated in a panel discussion with other healthcare innovators. The conversation focused on practical strategies for implementing culture change in medical settings, overcoming resistance from established bureaucracies, and measuring the impact of patient-centered approaches. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who had become a close colleague and mentor, posed a question to the panel: what advice would you give to healthcare workers who want to implement these changes but face institutional resistance? Claire's response drew from her own experience during Hurricane Elena. Start with individual Patient interactions. You can't always change institutional policies immediately, but you can always choose to treat the person in front of you with dignity and respect. Those individual acts of compassion accumulate into cultural transformation. She paused, thinking about the countless healthcare workers who had reached out to her over the past months, sharing their own stories of choosing patient welfare over administrative demands. Remember that every patient interaction is an opportunity to demonstrate what healthcare should be, Claire continued. When your colleagues see the positive results of compassionate care, when they witness how patients respond to being treated with dignity, they begin to understand that this isn't just about being nice, it's about being effective. After the panel concluded, Claire was approached by numerous healthcare professionals who wanted to discuss implementation strategies for their own facilities. She spoke with emergency room nurses from Detroit who were working to change triage protocols, with hospital administrators from Seattle who were redesigning patient intake processes, and with medical students from across the country who were inspired to make patient advocacy central to their future practices. One conversation particularly moved Claire. A young nursing student from rural Georgia explained how she had chosen her career after reading about Claire's experience during Hurricane Elena. "Ms. Thompson," the student said, "your story showed me that nursing isn't just about medical procedures and clinical skills. It's about standing up for people when they're vulnerable and scared. You proved that one person's commitment to doing right can change everything." Claire was humbled by the impact her story had generated. Letters and emails arrived daily from healthcare workers around the world who had been inspired to prioritize patient dignity in their own practice. Medical schools were incorporating case studies based on the Riverside Medical transformation into their curricula. Healthcare policy researchers were documenting the clinical and economic benefits of compassion-centered care. Later that evening, at a reception for summit participants, David Harrison approached Claire with a knowing smile. "So, have you made a decision about the CEO position?" The offer to lead Harrison Healthcare Solutions' national expansion had remained open for months. While Claire continued her work at Riverside Medical, she had used the time to thoroughly understand the scope of the opportunity and its potential impact on American healthcare. "David," Claire said, "I've decided to accept the position, but with one condition." David raised an eyebrow with interest. "What condition?" "I want to maintain a clinical practice," Claire explained. "I never want to become so removed from patient care that I forget why we're doing this work. I want to spend at least one day each week working directly with patients." David's smile broadened. "Claire, that's exactly the kind of condition that confirms you're the right person for this job. Someone who insists on staying connected to the fundamental purpose of healthcare is exactly who should be leading its transformation." The celebration was interrupted by an unexpected announcement. Dr. Martinez approached the small group with exciting news. "Claire," she said, "I wanted you to be among the first to know. The president has decided to establish a new federal initiative based on the work you've pioneered. The Department of Health and Human Services will be implementing dignity-centered care protocols at all federal medical facilities, including Veterans Administration hospitals and military medical centers." The scope of the announcement was breathtaking. The principles that had emerged from Claire's decisions during Hurricane Elena would now influence healthcare delivery for millions of Americans receiving care through federal programs. "There's more," Dr. Martinez continued. "The initiative will include a national fellowship program for healthcare workers who want specialized training in patient-centered care methodologies. The program will be headquartered at Riverside Medical Center, with you serving as its director." Claire felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the opportunity. What had begun as a simple commitment to treating patients with respect had evolved into a national movement that would train the next generation of healthcare leaders. As the evening progressed, Claire found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about the night of Hurricane Elena, when she had faced a choice between following protocol and following her conscience. She had chosen compassion, not knowing where that choice would lead. That decision had cost her nothing and gained her everything. It had revealed character that she didn't know she possessed, opened opportunities she couldn't have imagined, and created positive change that extended far beyond her individual actions. The transformation had affected everyone involved. David Harrison had discovered that business success and social impact could reinforce each other, leading him to dedicate significant resources to healthcare innovation. Marcus Rivera had found a leadership role that utilized both his military discipline and his commitment to service. Even Dr. Foster had been inspired to leave her prestigious position at Johns Hopkins to be part of a movement that prioritized healing over hierarchy. But perhaps most importantly, thousands of patients had received better care because one nurse had chosen to put their needs ahead of administrative convenience. Families had felt supported during medical crises, elderly patients had been treated with dignity, and children had received compassionate attention during frightening medical procedures. As the reception wound down, Claire stepped outside onto the hotel balcony, looking out over the lights of Washington, D.C. She thought about all the healthcare workers across the country who were making similar choices every day, choosing patient welfare over bureaucratic demands, choosing compassion over convenience. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jenny Walsh, her assistant at Riverside Medical. Mrs. Rodriguez called to thank you again. Her granddaughter was accepted to nursing school and wants to follow your example. Claire smiled, remembering the elderly woman whose life had been saved by David Harrison's helicopter during the hurricane. Mrs. Rodriguez had made a full recovery and had become one of the strongest advocates for the hospital's new patient care approaches. The message reminded Claire that the real measure of success wasn't the awards or recognition she had received, but the individual lives that had been touched by the commitment to treating every patient with dignity and respect. She thought about Sophie Harrison, now a healthy 9-year-old who visited the hospital regularly to read stories to young patients. She thought about Mr. Peterson, the diabetic man who had been living in his car during the hurricane, now housed and receiving regular medical care through the hospital's community outreach program. Each person represented a choice to prioritize human need over institutional convenience, a decision to see patients as people rather than cases to be processed. Claire's reflection was interrupted by the arrival of David Harrison, who joined her on the balcony. Thinking about the future, he asked. Actually, thinking about the past, Claire replied. About all the choices that led to this moment. David nodded thoughtfully. You know, Claire, Hurricane Elena destroyed a lot of things in Port Haven. Buildings, roads, infrastructure. But it also revealed something important about human character. It showed that when people are tested, their true priorities become clear. He paused, looking out over the city lights. That night, you were tested, and you chose to put patient welfare ahead of your job security. That choice changed everything. Not just for you, but for thousands of people who will receive better healthcare because of the systems you've helped create. Claire considered his words. David, I've learned that doing the right thing isn't always rewarded immediately. Sometimes it costs you in the short term. But eventually, character creates opportunities that credentials alone could never provide. That's exactly right, David agreed. And that's why this movement will continue to grow. Because it's based on principles that are timeless and universal. Treating people with dignity isn't a management fad or a policy initiative, it's a fundamental human responsibility. As they prepared to return inside, Claire felt a deep sense of purpose and direction. The work ahead would be challenging, implementing patient-centered care across multiple facilities, training healthcare workers in new approaches, and continuing to advocate for systemic change. But she was ready for the challenge. Hurricane Elena had taught her that crisis reveals character, and character creates change. The storm had passed, but the transformation it had initiated would continue for years to come. The young nurse who had once worried about losing her job for showing compassion had become a leader whose influence would touch millions of lives. And it all began with a simple decision to treat every patient as if they were family, to choose kindness over convenience, and to never forget that healing is about more than medical procedures, it's about honoring human dignity in moments of vulnerability. The hurricane had changed everything, but perhaps the most important change was the reminder that individual actions, guided by principle and compassion, have the power to transform entire systems and create a better world for everyone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.